Good morning, everyone. Morning. Thank you for being here on a Saturday morning. It's wonderful to see you all. I am Professor Salma Monani. I'm in Environmental Studies. I'm the Chair of Environmental Studies. And I have the wonderful opportunity to be part of this panel along with some colleagues of mine, Sarah Principato, who is a glacial geologist, also in Environmental Studies, and Chris Barlett, sorry, from psychology. And the reason the three of us are up here is that we have worked together on a project that was inspired by our students' interests. And we'll be talking about this project and then sort of also thinking a little bit about how we all come from these different backgrounds. I'm a humanist, Sarah is a natural scientist, and then Chris, of course, is a quantitative social scientist. And climate change is really something where you need all of that. So hopefully by the end of the panel, you'll have a sense of how we're all coming at it and have good questions for us as well. As moderator, I am going to hand it over to my panelists, and I'm going to let us all talk and then maybe save questions for the end when we can sort of put all of what we're doing together. So thank you all, and with no further ado.
Thank you. So Salma already mentioned I'm a glacial geologist, so I have been worried about climate change for a long time, actually. And before I talk about my research, I wanted to acknowledge all the students that have worked with me. So here's just 2 slides of some of them in the field. I've done a lot of work in Iceland, as you can see from the pictures. And a lot of students have also been in the lab and on the computer for many, many hours. So I want to thank all of these wonderful students for all their hard work. And what I study are glaciers and landforms. And so a little Icelandic for you is jökull, means glacier. And so the great thing about glaciers is they advance when it's cold and they melt away when it's warm. So they don't have any political opinions, they just do that. And they leave behind landforms. And what I study are the sediments and landforms that leave behind. So I'll start just briefly telling you about this. So here's a map of Iceland. It's about 11% covered by ice today, although it's shrinking every day. You might have seen the memorial service they had for a glacier this summer that melted away entirely. But I've worked a lot in the West Fjords. This region of Iceland. I've worked in some other areas, but I'm going to tell you about a case study from Kaldalandsjökull up in northwest Iceland. So, this is not. So here's a picture of Kristen Iguski, a Gettysburg alum now, and we are hiking up to the glacier, and along our way we're mapping out different landforms called moraines. They're ridges that mark the margin of the glacier. And so here's Kristen and Tess, another Gettysburg alum now, and we're at a moraine and we're marking them out, and we can piece it all together. And so just a very simple view of the modern ice is way back here, and here's one is the oldest moraine and going back this way. And so we can date these moraines, and number 1 is actually about 10,000 years old, but number 5 is from like 1930s. And so I don't have the scale on here, but it's about retreated at least 1 kilometer since the 1930s. So we do all this, and I published this with my students, and we've worked on other landforms as well in Iceland more recently. I always take my students to some modern glaciers in the south, and there's one called Solheimajökull. Has anybody been to this one? This is the one that you can get to very, very easily. It's in the movie Chasing Ice, so even though I'm not doing research on it, it's great to take the students there. And in 2013 was just one of the years that I've taken students there, and you can see Jess Lee with this big glacial erratic, a huge boulder carried by the ice, and then as it melted away, the boulder's there, and it's too big to get carried by water anymore, and the ice is behind it. So then we went back in 2017, and the same boulder, you can see how much it has moved back, several hundreds of meters in just 4 years. So let's look at that really closely to see how much it's retreated, and it's retreated so much that there's a cafe now, and you can buy hot chocolate. And so this is a rapidly retreating glacier, and so I've been noticing this and worrying about climate change. And I first went to Iceland in 1997, so it's been almost more than 20 years now. I've seen these glaciers, and I'm like, why don't people care about climate change? Why doesn't anybody worried about this? And now people are starting to worry, and so that's where I started working with Salma and Chris, because the scientists were just not very good at this. So we need to have more students like Dory and Brittany. And so I'm going to focus actually on the rest of this talk on the work that Salma, Chris, and I have done with Dory and Brittany. And I'm going to tell you about 2 projects. And so this is the interdisciplinary part of my talk here. One is about Glacier National Park, and the second study is about using film. And so just to go right into the study. So study 1 on Glacier National Park. Has anybody been to Glacier National Park? Oh, I haven't been there yet myself, so I'm very jealous of all of you. So it's a great place to study glaciers. And what we wanted to do is see if we could get people to care about climate change by using this theory of place attachment, where you get an emotional connection to a location. And we're going to use Glacier National Park virtually, because we couldn't take all of our Gettysburg College students to Glacier National Park. So we're trying to do this. So Dory, our student, made this website, Is It Hot Out Here? And she created it using WordPress, and it lives on, thanks to our wonderful IT colleagues. It lives on. You can still find the website. And she had all kinds of fun things on the website. She had interactive map. You can click on like each little pin, and you can see repeat photography that's from the USGS. And so Grinnell Glacier is the really famous one, and it's just so dramatic how much it's melted. And the same with Sperry Glacier, disappeared completely. Dory actually had a GeoCorps internship at Glacier National Park in between her junior and senior year, and she had to give talks called Bye Bye Glaciers to the people visiting the park. So it's really obvious. There was also a BuzzFeed quiz, which the students really liked, because of which glacier are you? So it was just for a little bit of fun on the website. And so then the participants took a survey before they looked at the website and after they looked at the website. And so I'll just show you some of our results. We had first a little demographics. We had 120 college students participate, all Gettysburg College students. The gender is mostly split, and political affiliation a little bit split, Democratic leaning. And here's our results. So before going to the website, so remember, didn't physically go there, we asked them, did you want to go to Glacier National Park? And there were a lot of maybes and some yeses, but the mode was maybe. And then after looking at the website, there's a statistically significant difference, and many more people wanted to go to Glacier National Park. So this gave us confidence we were developing this idea of place attachment virtually through the website. We wanted to focus on their climate change concern. And so before, the scale goes from the light colors are not concerned about climate change up to the dark green is very concerned about climate change. And before, the mode is probably in the middle. And then afterwards, everyone is much more concerned about climate change at Glacier National Park. And so it's statistically significant at the level of thinking about just Glacier National Park, but we also asked them, are you concerned about climate change locally where you live, and also globally? And so we made a big shift in how concerned they were just from looking at this website. And just to show you the impact of gender, we looked at a variety of factors. So another example of some of our results, before the website viewing, there was a statistically significant difference. Females were much more concerned even before looking at the website, which a lot of literature shows. But after the website, there was no statistically significant difference. Males and females were concerned. So that gave us hope that we can use this to make everyone concerned about climate change. And then there are lots of narrative comments. I'll just read you a few. The website has opened my eyes to the effects of climate change, specifically on a place like Glacier National Park. I may be a little more concerned about the future of our environment. And then my favorite one is this one. Putting a face on things and making it more evident what the changes are on a direct location always helps, because you see the pictures and the beauty and you become a little more attached. And we didn't tell them we were using place attachment, but it worked, and it's in the quote here. So this is just the first study. Virtual place attachment online increases climate change awareness. So this is our main finding, and Salma and I have published this together with our students, and so you can get a copy of it or ask us for a reprint. So this is my first delve away from scientific publication, so it's very exciting for me to get into this with Salma. And next I'll tell you about the project we worked on with Chris more specifically. And this is how does environmental film impact audience attitudes and behavior? And you'll hear more from Salma. She's the film expert, not me. And Chris could have talked about this study too, so it was hard to decide who should say this part. So a bunch of people have looked at environmental films, just some examples up here, and we followed the methods of Leisowitz and Howell most closely. But one thing they don't look at is, what if you give supplemental information and then have a survey 9 weeks later? Will they still be worried about climate change after that? And so we had 2 groups, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So the film we used is called The Human Element. Has anyone seen this film, The Human Element? A couple people have seen it. So it's by the same filmmaker that did Chasing Ice, if you've seen that movie, James Baylog. And here's some stills from the film, since most of you haven't seen it yet. It's really impactful. It's like got a lot of dramatic imagery. It focuses on water, fire, earth, and air. And we had 3 surveys for this study, one before they watched the film, one immediately after the film. And in these surveys, we used the PANIS scale, which is what Chris introduced us to, so he could tell you more about it than me. But it looked at how are you feeling right now, before the film and then after the film, to give us some really interesting information. And then we also had a 3rd survey 9 weeks after the film. And so we used the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications has the 6 America's Super Short Survey, SASSY for short, and it ranges from you're really alarmed about climate change down to you're dismissive about it. And so this scale here. So this was in all 3 surveys. So we were asking them kind of where did they fit in this scale each time that they did the survey. And so then we had a website was the way that, this is Brittany's project, to deliver the supplemental information. And we had half the participants get the website, and the other half was kind of a control group that didn't get the website at all. And so here's a picture of Brittany's website. And so the important thing about her website was it did have a lot of scientific facts, but it also had stories and actions and what you can do. And so to try to make more of a cultural connection for people. So we had participants from Gettysburg College and also from Alma College, one of Salma's colleagues that teaches there, gave it out. And it was really important that we tried to keep it a secret what the film was about, so we didn't bias our audience in any way. And we did not try to have intro environmental studies classes do it. We had it just broadly, on broadly advertised to try to get people from all over the campus to do it. So that's an important point. And we had pretty good response rate to survey 1 and 2 because they're just right there watching the film. And then there was a little lower response rate from survey 3 and following IRB protocols, which I learned all about IRB also. As a scientist, we don't use that, so that was very exciting to learn about. Everything's anonymous. And this, again, we had a little bit skewed female demographic in this survey and Democrat leaning, but split there again. So right away, our results before the film. So the SASSY survey runs from this, remember, alarmed all the way to dismissive. So before the film, we already have, most people are alarmed or concerned, most of the students. And so that makes sense. We're on a college campus, so we weren't too surprised by that. But the interesting thing is, right after the film, all the disengaged and doubtful go away, and the alarmed goes from 50% up to 62%. So the film itself made people much more alarmed than they were before watching it. And then the results of the 3rd survey, I'll show them a little differently. Instead of the circles again, I'll show you what it looks like compared to the national average and a histogram. So our results are in this orangish color compared to the national average response to the SASSY survey. And you can see these are the average Americans are all over the map, but our film made people much more alarmed, even 9 weeks later. So that gave us hope that film really can have a big impact. And then this is Chris's design, and he should tell you more about this slide. But we looked at how did the groups differ, the people that got the website compared to not get the website. So if they got the website, they were in blue, this blue line, and if they didn't get it, they were in orange. And to start, already the blue group understood a little bit more about climate change. But what I'll have you focus on is time 3, this 3rd survey. The group that got the supplemental information from Brittany's website understood a lot more about climate change than the group that did not. And this is statistically significant result. So the supplemental information made a big difference. We also had some narrative comments. Do you feel more or less motivated to do something about climate change now than when you immediately saw the film? Why or why not? And so there were 3 kind of answers to this question that we're still working through all these, but the first group is, yes, it showed me shocking images. Sometimes we want to believe are not real. No, I was more motivated right after the film. My emotions were all over the place. I felt more connected to the issue than I do now. And then a bunch of people said, the same. I'd like to help make a difference, but I have a lot of schoolwork in the moment and stress. And this is during finals week approximately, so we weren't surprised to get this response. And I haven't been able to think about it very often. And the interesting thing is the people that answered yes were the ones that got the website. And the people that said no or the same did not get the website. So this is really showing us that the supplemental information can really make a big difference. So I'll just summarize study 2. Film is a powerful tool, and if you give supplemental information, it can extend the impact of watching the film. And so concluding just my little piece, we need low-cost methods of climate change communication, not just science, but we need to work with our colleagues across disciplines. And virtual place attachment works, and film also can increase understanding with repeated information. And this study was funded by the Provost's Office and a Colby Fellowship to Brittany and the ES department at Gettysburg College. So thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Salma.
Thank you, Sarah. It was so fun working on it. I think in some ways these are a project that our students force us to get outside our comfort zones, and so it's really fun working with them on that. I am, of course, a humanist, and so all the quantitative work was neat. I have a background in science, so it wasn't that I was unfamiliar with it, but it was sort of neat to sort of jump back into it and have my colleagues help me with that. But what I'm going to talk about now is the humanities and climate change, and specifically I'm going to talk about some of the other research that I do, and specifically focus on indigenous perspectives in climate fiction. And fiction here, I'm talking about fictional film in particular. I'm an ecomedia scholar, so as a media scholar, I'm really interested in visual media. And so I want to say just a teeny little bit about ecomedia studies. Has anyone heard that term before? It's a relatively new area of media studies, but really if you think about it, it's really just the study of the intersections of environment and non-print and visual media. So things like websites and films that Sarah's talking about, and there are a whole bunch of different ways in which we do our work. And so one of the ways that we were getting into is actually a very recent way of thinking about it, because the humanists are also sort of saying just coming at it from a humanities lens is not enough. And this is called empirical eco-criticism. So it brings communication studies, it brings quantitative psychology in to conversations with narrative studies, which tends to be much more traditionally humanities. And a lot of my work actually focuses on that traditional humanities approach. And when, for most of you, you know that, but just coming from a sort of literary American studies background, for me that really is looking at text, right? Trying to think of the style and the aesthetics and what are the stories being told, how are they being told, and of course why are they being told, right? So we're always thinking of text within context. And for me in particular, I have looked a lot at cinema. So film is my area. So within eco-media studies, I am what you might consider an eco-cinema studies scholar. And some of the film that I look at, a lot of the film that I look at, has to do with indigenous media. And this is a publication that came out a little while ago, a couple of years ago, but as you can see, it has indigenous studies in there as well. So just a little bit about what indigenous media is. When I'm talking about indigenous media, I'm really talking about indigenous people have creative control. So I'm not looking at a film that has indigenous people in it, but are made by non-indigenous people. And just because I've had this question asked to me too, what do I mean by indigenous people? I'm really using the UN definition over here. So communities that have pre-colonial contact, and because my research is in the US, when we're thinking about Native American communities, and I also work on Canadian communities, so First Nations, Métis communities. So that is really sort of the background. And then at this point, you're probably saying, what happened to climate change? Where does climate change fit into all this? The chapter in this book actually looks at a film that I'll talk very briefly about that has this climate change narrative. But in general, when we think about climate change and we start to think about indigenous people's relations to climate change, there are various ways we can come at it. And one of the most important sort of things that we see is that we know that indigenous people are on the front lines of climate change. No better place to say about this in the media as the Arctic. We know the Arctic is changing drastically. Indigenous people, as a consequence, living in the Arctic are really experiencing those changes. So they're there, they're sort of trying to deal with it, grapple with it in terms of what they're doing. This picture here is a still from a film. So we're getting back to thinking about indigenous media. And this, some of you might know the filmmaker, Zacharias Canuck. He's like perhaps the most well-known indigenous filmmaker in Canada. He made a film called Fast Runner, which sort of changed the way we think about indigenous filmmaking. But this sort of film, these sort of representations, because they bring indigenous perspectives into the conversations that we have, are really interesting to me. And I have been really, really lucky that thanks to Gettysburg College being able to fund my research, I get to go to a place where I can access a lot of indigenous media. And this is the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival. It's the biggest indigenous film festival in the world. It happens every year. It's a global one. I think there were like 20,000 people that came to downtown Toronto to come to this festival last year. It's in a couple of weeks, and I'll be heading up there. And I've taken students there as well, which is also really exciting. But when you think festival, you think, oh, you're just going to watch a bunch of movies. That's all you're doing. It's actually a lot more than that. It's a critical space. It's a space where they're not just films, new films, but there's a ton of panel discussions. There's a ton of conversations going on. And what I get to do as a researcher is not just look at the text, but I get a sense of the context. And a lot of my work over there involves interviewing filmmakers, etc. So I get to do that, and it's exciting with all the programming that they have. Here's a screenshot from the upcoming program. You look at it, and you can see, for someone who does environmental context, there's a ton of work that looks like it has indigenous relations with land, whether it's trees or bears or water, right? And whether it's documentary film or fiction film, there's all this stuff over here. But the other thing I want you to notice over here is that you have a lot of contemporary images of Native people. And so this is something that is really interesting and useful of thinking about these relationships that Native people have with the land. And the media itself is representing this so that it sort of pushes back against popular depictions of Native people as the past. And what do I mean by this? Well, some of you might have seen these movies, right? Any of you seen any of these movies? These are popular movies, but in each of these cases, right, you see this notion of Native people as if they were people of the past and not of the present, right? And so a lot of this media is saying, no, we're here, we're dealing with things like climate change, and how are we dealing with it? What can we get out of that? What's interesting to me, too, and what has been a big part of thinking about these relationships is not just the present, but the future. Right? So there's this whole thing on science fiction. Are there any science fiction buffs in this room? Just one, not too many. But there's a lot of work that Native people do on science fiction, because it sort of says that we're not just people of the present, but we're also thinking of our futures. When we think climate change, of course, that is very much a discourse of the future that we're thinking of. So it's really about indigenous futurisms. And I'm not, this is work that's been done by other people over here. My colleague, Willie Lampert, is at Bowdoin, and he started to talk a lot about films. I actually do want to talk about this film. It's a film made by a Navajo filmmaker, Nanoba Becker. It's called The Sixth World: An Origin Story, and it's a science fiction film that sort of looks to the future. And this is what it's about. It's about Navajo traveling to Mars to make it their new home. And that's kind of like, yeah, right? And it actually, in many ways, is kind of fun, because it's a short film. It's just 50 minutes. If anyone is interested, it was made with independent television, so you can go to independent television's website and watch it for free. It was a very low-budget film. But what's neat for me as a filmmaker, as a film scholar interested in those aspects, it has a very generic component to it. It's a genre film. Is there anyone in here who likes Star Trek films? A few people. It's got that same sort of sense of a Star Trek film. And the whole premise of the film basically is something's happened on Earth, they have to leave Earth. And most of the film is on the spaceship, and there's sort of the trials and tribulations. Are they going to make it to Mars? Are they not? Things go wrong. If you've seen Star Trek films, there's like things beeping, et cetera, right? And so we're in this space over here, and the question is, do they or do they not make it to Mars? A lot of people have written about this film because it's kind of fun and hokey in that way, but what really interests me is that it's not just science fiction, it's what you might call climate fiction, or the term is cli-fi. And the reason why is because, this is a screenshot from the end of the film, but the reason why is when I was at Imaginative, I was able to actually interview, not just see the film, but I was able to interview the filmmaker about it. And this is what she says. She says, I'm thinking about global warming and degradation to the planet and about its consequences, right? So she's making this film very much sort of thinking that what we're doing now to the Earth potentially might lead to thinking other worlds, other places to go, right? But I want us to think about this a little bit in these larger narratives of climate change. So as someone who's a humanist, I'm very interested in those narratives, right? What are the narratives? This is the film that Sarah showed. This is a documentary film. This is showing images from reality, not fiction, right? And often when we think about that, this notion of climate crisis, climate emergencies, those are the words that you often see in the world out there. Like humanists are sort of seeing it. Sarah's talking about the emotional impacts that people have when they see these sort of narratives. So I want to share a quote over here. It's a quote that says, portrayals of the Anthropocene period are often dystopic of post-apocalyptic narratives of climate crises that will leave humans in horrific science fiction scenarios. It's not like this is all that climate fiction is talking about, but there's certainly that narrative, and it is out there. What I want to do now, though, is tell us a little bit about how this relates to indigenous perspectives. Because this quote is by a colleague of mine who is Potawatomi. He's an indigenous scholar who does a lot with climate justice. And he says, yeah, that narrative exists. People are afraid of what climate change might do. But he says, what happens when you put Native people into that conversation? And he says, the hardships many non-indigenous people dread most of the climate crisis are ones that indigenous people have endured. So things like ecosystem collapse, species loss, economic, drastic location, cultural loss. Of course, he's talking about colonization, right? And he's talking about what that has done to indigenous people. So for his own people, the Potawatomi people, for example, they underwent a form of climate change. They underwent a form of losing all these things that were so important to them when they had to be relocated from their homelands. For him, though, the important thing is not just to think of these histories, but to think of this within climate change narratives today. People went through all this, and yet they have still existed, their ways of life still exist, and they have survived. And so he says there are narratives in here that we don't pay attention to. Narratives of resilience and adaptability that can be very useful when you think of your own communities now at the front lines of climate change. So for indigenous people to look back to that and sort of say, what helped us then, can we use that now as we move forward into the new world, right? And this takes us back to that film that I was talking about, because these sort of documentary ideas come back in fictional form. And this is really a story about resilience and adaptability. Do they make it to Mars? What do you think? Yeah, they do, right? They undergo the tribulations and all the rest of it. But what's interesting to me, as a scholar looking at this work, is that the way the filmmaker thinks about it is in that process of trying to figure things out. She's bringing that traditional ecological knowledge of what Native people have into this futuristic world, into new circumstances of trying to figure out how to deal with the sort of worries that they have. A huge part of them going into space is trying to keep their crops alive so they can use it when they are in space, right? And the whole message, I can talk more about it forever, but I'm not going to. All I'm going to say is that the narrative is really about working with nature in ways that we might think about differently than we have thought about currently, or the way we think about. And that is something that climate change narratives are all about. How do we work with nature as nature starts changing? So I want to say that, and then I want to say, some of you are probably sitting over here and saying, it's just a story, it's just fiction, right? So why pay attention to crazy fiction like this? Why not look more specifically at the sort of hardcore documentary work, realistic work that's been done? And there is a lot of that. There are reports that have been written. This was a government report, actually, in 2014, and it has a whole chapter on thinking about Native people and how they're dealing with it, right? And I would come back with two answers that I hear a lot from the artists that I work with. And the first one is because of audience reach. The sort of work that science fiction does, that popular media does, is the work that can reach much further than that hardcore national report does. And especially youth, whether it's indigenous youth or other youth. For us teaching in classes, we certainly see our students sort of plug into that. And the last thing that I want to say is that imagination, right? These are all about imagination. And Carl Sagan, who I think a lot of you know, he says, imagination will carry us to worlds that never were, but without it, we go nowhere. And sci-fi allows us to imagine, and cli-fi allows us to imagine. So much so that that these two ideas, you can put them together, and I'm gonna end with a quote from Aboriginal youth group that met in Australia not too long ago, and they have that quote up here. They have an imagination declaration that they presented to their government. I'm just going to leave it up there. I'm not going to read, but I do want to acknowledge our own youth. We are inspired by the work that our students do. I've worked with students on this, so I leave that, and then a lot of other acknowledgments as well, and I'm going to stop right there.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I get to end today. However, I get to follow two really good talks, so I'm hoping my talk doesn't suck too bad. My name is Chris Barlett. I'm in the psychology department. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit of a different spin than the previous two talks that we've heard, in the sense that I'm going to be talking today about a study that we recently published looking at the behavioral effects that can occur as a function of global warming and global temperature change. And the real impetus for this particular study was based on the training that I got in graduate school, where my advisor, his name is Dr. Craig Anderson. He's probably one of the most world-famous researchers on the study of aggression. He was really interested in what's called the heat hypothesis. So does being really hot makes you more aggressive? That was the question. Of course, I think we all can be in here and be like, yeah, if I'm really hot, I'm a little on edge, I'm a little irritable. And what he wanted to do was extend that, all right, to more, instead of just, are you hot right now, to being at a global or at a bigger level, sociological level, what effect does heat have on us? And that's where I kind of fit into this thing. Really recently, 2019, Craig Anderson and his colleagues published a paper. It was a review article, and in this review article, what he laid out was a theoretical idea regarding how we can get from global temperature change, so the world's getting hotter, all the way to really kind of bad behavioral consequences of that, specifically homicide. So how is it that if you are, as global temperatures go up, what is the relationship between homicide rates? And what he laid out in this particular article were 3 ways that we can get there. However, it was a review article. He has, with very little data to support a lot of these assertions, I said to myself, well, we can do that. Gettysburg College, we can do that. And we did. So I'm going to talk about that today. So here's what he said. His theoretical model starts with the general idea, global warming is happening. Done. Like, that's how we're going to start this thing. And then what he said is as the temperatures go up, what's going to happen is that's going to lead to a lot of catastrophic climate-related events. For example, as global warming goes up, we're going to have an increased temperature of our core. In addition, that's going to bring out a lot of climate and weather-related issues such as drought, rising sea levels, flooding, extreme weather events like tornadoes and earthquakes, and just crazy snowstorms like I heard Montana's going to get soon. If not, is it today? Is it today? Yeah, but that's happening over there. All of these things, he says, okay, global warming is happening. That's what's going to be the first immediate consequence. Then what's going to happen is where things get interesting with his idea. Remember, we have 3 ways to get there. The first, he said, the first route is what he calls the direct effects. In other words, we get irritable when we get hot. And what that's going to do is that's going to lead to aggression. All right? Now this, as a psychologist, this has been studied a lot. So again, this is what's called the heat hypothesis. And a psychologist can do this very easily in their lab. Basically what they do in these particular studies is they randomly assign participants to sit in like a little closet. It's like a little closet, and these closets are temperature controlled, such that you can change how hot or how cold it is within those little closets. And participants, it's just enough size to fit a desk, and you can do stuff on the computer. And in these studies, what happens is all participants tend to get provoked. So in the lab, we can provoke people ethically. I do it in my lab all the time. It's interesting. And what we do after we provoke them is we can change the temperature of the room such that some people are in a room that's very, very cold, let's say 53 degrees Fahrenheit, where other people are in a room that's really hot, like 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and we can put people in all sorts of rooms, temperature-wise. And then what they do after that is they measure aggression using ethically, let me be clear on that, ethical, aggression-related kind of tasks. All right, so we're doing it by the books, trust me. And typically what research tends to find is this inverted U shape, such that when the temperatures are really, really cold or when the temperatures are really, really hot, the level of aggression goes up. And when the temperature is really comfortable, aggression tends to cool down a little bit. What's happening here, though, is what Anderson talks about the heat hypothesis is that, and not the cold hypothesis, he doesn't call it that, is because what he found in the subsequent studies is that the cold effect, so that graph kind of near the cold temperatures, that really high bar tends to go away when you account for things like people can escape the cold. You can always put on another blanket or a sweater or a coat or a hat or whatever you do to keep warm. However, you can only do so much when you're really hot. And so because of that, what he found is that people tend to be more irritable, and that makes them more aggressive. This has been found in many studies, meta-analytically, experimentally. It's been done a lot, all right? So the route 1, to me, at least as it pertains to this talk, not so important. I just wanted to acknowledge that it exists. However, it is one of his ways in his theory. The other 2 ways are what I'm interested in for today, all right? What he says next is going to happen is, so you got global warming, makes these catastrophic kind of climate, weather-related issues happen, and that is going to relate to a country's, basically their economy. What's going to happen is you're going to have, let's say you have a drought, that's going to lead to failed crops, that's going to lead to hard difficulty getting access to clean drinking water. It's going to cause people to move. Imagine, for example, in the foreseeable future, if Miami goes underwater. Where are all those people going to go? Well, they have to go somewhere else. They're going to migrate somewhere. And what's going to happen then is, let's say they move to let's say they go to Orlando. All of a sudden now Orlando's like, wow, we don't have enough water or food to feed all of you. And what he claimed is that's going to lead to problems. The 2 problems that he has is this. Number 1, violence-prone adults. What he claimed here, and this is the one that's a little harder to kind of grasp if you think about it, what he claimed here is that if you live in an area that has really poor resources, that is going to lead to aggressive-prone adults. His argument here was based on research that shows that malnourished mothers tend to produce aggressive children later in life. And it's because of the prenatal care that they don't receive and the prenatal nutrients they do not receive. Therefore, what's going to happen is that later on down the line, you're going to have aggressive-related individuals. And those aggressive people are more likely to commit violent crimes and go to war and all those things. We can't do anything with that. I don't have any data for that. Like that's hard data I don't know how to get. However, what I do have data on today is the 3rd route. And the 3rd route starts like this. What's going to happen is if you have this competition for resources, that's going to lead to civic unrest and war, which is going to lead to violence. We can test that one. I'm going to show you how today. But if we put Anderson's entire model together, it looks like this. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of arrows, a lot of boxes. And so what I'm going to do today is focus on just one route within this. I don't have the data to test all the theories that exist because there's a lot going on in here, so I'll just do what I can. And we'll get to the picture first. You good? Awesome. Thank you. So routes 2 and 3, the found work has been laid. So remember, route 1, that's been done a lot. Route 2 has been done at a societal level. And basically what these researchers found is that if you correlate the average temperature in the US over time, it predicts homicide rates over time. And so what Anderson has done in his work is he gets the average temperature for the 50 largest cities in the United States. You can get that online, it's free. You can also get the FBI crime statistics report for those cities, and you can gauge how many assaults, how many murders were there. And what he does is he correlates them, and he finds a pretty substantial correlation, such that as the temperature of these cities go up, so does the number of assaults and rapes and homicides. They go up as well. And he has found this. Now you should be like, well, that's just silly, because there are so many individual things about each city that makes things different. And what he has done is he has found this effect while controlling for the season, so the summer months versus the winter months. He's found this while controlling for the economic instability of any particular city, the population of that city, also the year in which the data was collected, and any autocorrelations that can occur because you're sampling over multiple years. So in other words, it seems to be a pretty robust effect. However, this is only specific to the United States. And so what I wanted to do was expand this in 2 ways. Number one is do this at a global level. The second thing I wanted to do was test his model. I wanted to test what he's called mediating mechanisms, how we get from global warming early to homicides much later. I wanted to talk about how we get there, right? So here's what I did. I went to the World Bank. If you're unfamiliar with the World Bank, it has nothing to do with money, which is very sad because I could always use some. Provost office, give us some money. Instead, what's going to happen at the World Bank is it is a data repository for a whole host of variables, over hundreds of them. And it's all free. It's big data, so it's all free. And what I did is I scoured the World Bank to see what variables would best map on to Anderson's model. All right? So what I did was I found temperature, extreme weather, clean water access, food production, and homicide rates. These map on very cleanly. I'll show you actually that in a second. It should be noted that this is global, so all countries contribute to the World Bank. However, no country is required to. So if you look at the N countries, that's the number of countries who gave us the data, is very different because not a lot of countries like reporting their homicide rates, for example. In terms of the years, what we did is, so you got to imagine this massive data set. We have data from 1961 all the way to 2015 for as many variables as we could for over 200 countries, all right? And what we did is we had to parse this apart. Unfortunately, what the World Bank does is it collapses together extreme weather from 2 decades, from 1990 to 2009, into one variable. So it doesn't do it year by year, it collapses it together. All the other variables are year by year. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make causal claims, or at least start to, about our data, showing that temperature, global warming comes first, that leads to weather second, just like Anderson's model says. So we had to be very careful about what years we selected, so there's no temporal overlap, all right? Because, once again, extreme weather was already collapsed for us, we were bound. So therefore, we had to get temperature from 61 to 89. We ended at 89, because extreme weather started from 90 to 2009, and you guys can see how the rest kind of plays out. All right. So in terms of, this is Anderson's model again, if we were going to remap what I did, in red you'll kind of see how everything maps onto this, such that instead of global warming, well, we don't have that. What we have is an index of their temperature. We have extreme weather events. Then we're going route 3, so we went failed crops. That's going to be the food production. We also have access to clean water, although that's not depicted in here. We think that's going to lead to resource competition, and then we have violent crime. Specifically, we have homicide rates. So what was nice about the World Bank is we found the data existed that mapped onto this very well. What we wanted to do as researchers is just figure out how these play together. Because remember, this is the behavioral consequence. So instead of talking about like what causes climate change or what we can do about it, this is like, it's happening. If we don't do anything about it, here's what's likely to happen later, right? All right, so here's what we did. What I'm going to show you is our results from our statistical analysis. If you're not a stat person or a number person, you're going to see numbers and you're going to see stats, and just don't be afraid of it. Several of my students are, and I'll work you through it. It'll be nice and easy. So we have the average temperature. That's of the world, at least the 208 countries that contributed, averaged together across all those years, predicting extreme weather events. Then we're going to have those predicting both food production and access to clean drinking water, and all that's going to predict homicide rates later on. So what we have first the first link here. So that first number, that 0.05, that is a unstandardized regression coefficient. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. All you need to know is that it's positive. That suggests to us that as average temperature goes up, so does the number of extreme weather events. Now, in order to know if that is a significant relationship or not, you have to look at the numbers in parentheses. Those are confidence intervals. If those numbers include 0, that means it's not true. The link's not there. This ignores 0. See how it goes around it? What that tells us is that not only as the average temperature goes up, so does extreme weather events, it also tells us that is a statistically significant effect. All right? So in other words, that's happening. Now, the next part is the food production. Same idea here. Remember, these are unstandardized. That's how you got such high numbers. What's this telling us is that as the number of extreme weather events go up, so does your food production. I think this makes a little bit of sense, such that if you live in an area that was ravaged by a hurricane last year, if you can, you're probably going to make more food in case it happens again next year, right? That's one argument. That's the argument we made. In addition, what we see is a negative relationship here, such that as your number of extreme weather events, tornadoes and hurricanes and whatnot goes up, your access to clean drinking water goes down. All right? In terms of the homicide rates, what we see here is an interesting effect such that food production has nothing to do with homicides. I was not expecting that, but sure enough, it does not. But what's the more important thing is going to be the clean drinking water. That's going to be a negative relationship, and it's significant. What that tells us is that as drinking water access goes down, your homicide rates go up. So if we were to piece all of this together, before we piece it all together, for those who care about stats with these numbers and all these things, what that tells us is that the data, how the arrows are placed, how the boxes are, what's there and what's not, fits the actual data really, really well. So in other words, these boxes and arrows, it actually describes the data very, very well. Now, in addition, what we can do is we can look at, so you got the whole model there, we can actually look at what we call indirect paths. These are testing the mediating relationships. In other words, why is it that we get from temperature in the 60s and 70s and 80s all the way to homicides in the 2010s and above? How do we get there? Well, according to research, according to our study, what we found is that this is what's called a mediating effect, such that, and it is significant, such that as temperature goes up, extreme weather goes up. Extreme weather events go up. As extreme weather events go up, your drinking water goes down. As your drinking water goes down, your homicide rates go up. In other words, it's kind of like a chain reaction here, right? It's a chain reaction here. And basically what we're trying to do, once again, is predict this behavior, obviously very antisocial behavior. So in conclusion, what we can get from this is that we know that now from this that early global temperatures are related to violence, and it's not just in the United States anymore. Once again, this is the first study that I've seen that assesses at a global level. This also tells us that we know why it is now. So at least according to our data, what we found is, once again, this chain reaction, such that temperature leads to extreme weather, which leads to water scarcity, which leads to homicide rates occurring. And remember, the ordering of the years is going to be important for temporal reasons, right? It's not like all this was done in the year 2011. This is spread out across time. And guess what? The temperature data stopped, 1989? It's a little bit hotter now. And so you can just, if we were to extrapolate, you can see how this could actually get stronger now. Finally, we supported Anderson's model. He liked that. I sent him this paper, and he's like, yeah, let's get that published. Because remember, his data, his review paper had no data in it. This actually supports what he was thinking. So he's like, let's do it. We did it. However, I don't want to ignore the fact that other mediators could happen. If you remember his model, there was a lot in there. There was migration, there was failed crops. I mean, there's so much stuff in there, and we could only get data on just a little bit of it. And so this is one of those things where future research can further test these mediating routes as well. And finally, my hope is that when these types of papers come out, the hope is that you have a case where high-level individuals will hopefully, like high-level, like in the government, actually reads these types of things and doesn't discount science and then says, hey, wow, you're trying to tell us that if our globe increases temperature this much in this amount of time, that's going to lead to people killing each other? We should probably listen. At least that's my optimistic hope for the world, is that people actually listen to this kind of stuff. I'm happy you guys are listening to this kind of stuff, because you're the first step, right? With that said, I want to thank you all so much. I'm told I got 10 minutes left, so we are right on track. So thank you.
This is great, and I think it's time for you all to ask us questions. Yes.
First of all, thank you for this. Obviously, it's a very important issue. We're all kind of conditioned to change, and people are resistant to change, but we talk to each other about change is good. And in this context, climate change doesn't necessarily imply good or bad. And I'm kind of a numbers guy, as well. If you didn't know anything about climate change and you'd say, oh, climate's changing, you might think, well, is that good or bad? I'm learning now we're killing each other over this. But I don't think I've read anything about a positive impact from climate change. So the question to Sarah is, kind of physically in the plant environment, are you aware of things that would be considered to be a good result from climate change? And Christopher, is it really the psychology of humans that we dwell on the negatives and we want to fix things, and that's why the conversations seem to be exclusively about the negative part of this?
So climate change scientifically is just bad globally. It's sea level rising, ocean acidification, more extreme weather events. I suppose it depends where you live. You could potentially have a good impact if you're in Canada and you like warmer weather or something like that. But it's mostly just really bad. And in fact, one thing I was thinking of mentioning when I was talking about why don't more people care is the Department of Defense in 2014 released a report that it's one of the biggest threats to the United States national security. So it's really not good. I'm sorry. I try not to leave my students, though, with all the bad, because I teach a senior seminar on climate change, and we do try to look at, what can we do and how can we make it better? And so I look at the students, and I hope one of them will come up with a great solution to it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, because it is bad. And in fact, I think Salma could talk about the semantics and the use of text, but everyone used to just say global warming, but climate change is so much more encompassing than just global temperature. There's sea level, I already mentioned some of them, but sea level rise, the millions of people that are gonna have to relocate. And I was just at a conference at the Geological Society of America, and it's not, you don't even have to think about Bangladesh and countries that are, you should think about those countries, but right here in the US, Miami, Charleston, they have what's called nuisance flooding now, sunny day flooding. They get floods, and the downtown streets are just flooded. New York City, so I feel like the downer of the group, but it's all bad.
Hi. Oh, it works. Great. To answer your part, to me, the answer is yes. As humans, we have a natural indication to pay more attention to the negative than the positive. Just as an example, if you go to the doctor and you're told you you tore your rotator cuff, you're always just like, well, I want a second opinion. Like, bad news is always like, oh, we got to get second opinion. Like, we urge that kind of thing. But if you get a clean bill of health, you're not like, well, I'm going to go see another doctor to see if I have a clean bill of health. Like, that doesn't exist. And so it's one of those things. That's right. That's right. So it's one of those things where, yes, we tend to be more prone to pay more attention to the negative, and you can imagine the evolutionary reason for why that is. Like, if negative events are happening, that might mean you die. Positive events mean you probably won't die. So, yes, we tend to pay more attention to the negative, which is why, at least from psychology's point of view, when we talk about climate change or global warming, it tends to really focus on the negative aspects of it and how we can fix it. And one of the things that you said is there's a lot of good research on looking at how people form disbelief, like, oh, climate change isn't real, and it's called, there's a lot of good research on belief perseverance, and like, you really are motivated to believe that because you want to believe that you're going to live, and the world's a great place to live in, and it makes you feel good to believe that way. So from a psychological point of view, absolutely.
Thank guess I'll add the humanist's point of view, and that is where I think imagination is very important. So the last quote that I put up on the board, which many of you could not read, potentially, is from young people, sort of saying, we know this is happening, we know it's not necessarily the best thing, but how do we deal with it in the best ways we can? How can we imagine a future where we will not be what Chris is talking about? And I think that's kind of why this is such a interdisciplinary topic. You just can't come at it from one angle. Yes.
Very recent history. I think we can see that in very recent history. Things that are going on now. Was crop failures in Guatemala, so people are migrating through Mexico to come to the United States so they can support their families. Islands in the South Pacific that are being impacted by major storms, or we've got the Bahamas. And where do those people go? Are they going to go to Greenland or Iceland, where they're not comfortable in that climate, they're not skilled at survival in that climate? Are they going to come to another part of the world? And what happens to that? How do we as a world look at changing people? And it's still very much a not in my backyard. Yes, somebody needs to help those people, but not me. I don't want them moving to my neighborhood. And so how do we as a world deal with that? But yet we're going to have to if we're all going to survive on the planet.
Was that a question? I think actually, for me, working with indigenous communities, I find that very useful, because these are communities that have had a lot sort of negative thrown at them. And they often, this notion of resilience and adaptability and having the ability to sort of think through those ideas and think about how you do that is very powerful. And I certainly think we all need to sort of think about ways in which we can do that. And be better people, understand that it's, we're all victims and we're not. And so to maybe move out of the sort of, we're victims, oh my God, we're really, as opposed to, we can do something about this.
As a follow-up on that question, what are your students doing here locally in Gettysburg?
A lot.
I meant to put in the picture of the climate strike that they had just a week ago, approximately, and walk out on their classes to protest the government's inaction to climate change. So the campus is becoming more, so I came to Gettysburg in 2003, and I see the students becoming more mobilized and more concerned about it. There's a variety of student groups. Gettysburg Environmental Concerns Organization, GECO, is one. There's Biosphere. And a bunch of them are going to a climate change communication networking conference next weekend up at Dickinson College. And there's what else should I add?
I guess I should also say they're taking classes.
You are actually measuring and moving the campus, like, I'm cold in here today. Why aren't you thinking locally?
Oh, we are. We had a student who just did a senior honors thesis on a sustainable plan for Gettysburg College. We have been active about this for a long time. We need everybody on board. We need the administration on board as well. We work with the resources we have, but it's not like we're not trying. Yeah.
Well, to follow up with that point, every July the Sierra Club puts out a scorecard on colleges and universities. It ranks 240 of them based on their climate studies organizations and what they do to the physical plant at the college. Gettysburg has yet to be ranked. Dickinson's in the top 10. So I'm glad you're in Iceland, and I'm glad you go to Native American film festivals, but what about right here in our own backyard?
That is a great question. Environmental Studies Department has been working on this for years. When I taught senior seminar in 2009, we made a greenhouse gas inventory for the campus, and now the facilities department has interns every summer, continue to do that. We look very closely internally, and we've hit a lot of roadblocks with the administration, quite frankly. I shouldn't say that right now with that. We have a new administration, so who knows what's going to happen. It's tricky because of the financial situation that they deal. I don't know. I mean, I'm giving a bad answer to this, but
You could help wonderfully by helping give us the sort of resources and also spread the message that this is really important, right? The fact that you have numbers that we are so familiar with that Gettysburg does not rank up there amongst all the other colleges that do it. Yet consistently as a department, we are so good that we get called out to these colleges to do the external department reviews. And then we go to these other campuses where they have wind energy and all the rest of it, and we come back feeling like, why aren't we doing that here, right? And we would love to use the alums to help sort of help us get there. But also, on a positive note, I've been here 12 years now, and there are a number of things that we have done. We're moving extremely slowly, way slower than we want to go, but it's not that we're not moving. So dining service is a great example. I teach a food class. That food class is very much locally based. This is a wonderful agricultural place. But our dining services went trayless, and has food waste that they're thinking about. All these things that they were not doing previously. So it's not that we're not trying, but yes, if somebody wants to give us lots of money.
Or something.
Well, one thing that we struggle with is we don't have a sustainability coordinator on campus, and that is something that is a position that helps coordinate all of this work. We do the work we do on a voluntary basis. And it's not that we don't enjoy doing it, but it is will, and it's not will, it is time. Literally, it is time and money, I think. And Will is sitting right behind you, and Will Lane is a fantastic proponent. So I want to actually let him say a little bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to share some kind of good news. I'm actually based in English, but I have a pinky kind of touching environmental studies as well. And both of my classes this semester, both are writing classes, but they're researching based on that sustainability action plan, what other schools are doing. And we're planning to bring those two classes together to present to the community a plan for going further in about 7 different areas that relate to what colleges can do. And one of them, of course, will be encouraging the hiring of a sustainability coordinator, someone who year after year can keep an eye on this and push it forward, because we have had many great students doing work, just as the student last year, but if there isn't someone solely focused on that, it can slip, the good results can slip away. So what I'm trying to do with my classes is to be part of that process. So there will be some noise made later in the semester. Thanks.
Thank you to my fellow panelists and to all of you for coming out. Thank you.